mistakes. We all make them. And for athletes, these often end up in poor performance, or worse yet, injuries, illness, burnout. And this is a huge negative. I've watched hundreds and hundreds, maybe thousands of athletes make these stupid mistakes that ends up costing them the game, costing them their season, costing them a career. But the big thing is that we can learn from them. We don't have to make the same mistakes. Okay, so a mistake is obviously a negative. But if we choose not to make that mistake, that would be another negative. And if we look down at our mathematical chart, a negative times a negative is a huge positive. The problem is our brains are not wired to think this way. Of course, we know if we choose to do something bad, we're going to get a bad negative result. And same thing, if we choose not to do something good, we're going to get a negative result. And obviously, if we choose to do something that's going to be beneficial, we're going to get a positive result. But here's where the money in, and this is a defining characteristic of world champion athletes. Not choosing to make a bad mistake becomes a huge positive. And world champion athletes make the fewest mistakes mainly because they've made the most mistakes. And so, we can learn from them. We don't have to reinvent the wheel, nor do we have to reinvent the broken wheel. And this isn't a one-time thing. This applies to so many things we do, not only in our training, but in our lives, our relationships, our family, friends, co-workers. But this ability is not an inherent trait. It can be learned. It can be trained. It can be improved. And the heart of a lot of it is learning to say no. And let's talk about one big thing that predisposes us to making poor decisions. And that, of course, is stress. We can see here in our little chart. So we experience stress in any part of your life. Of course, if you're an elite, highly competitive athlete, there's a time where you're very stressed from the training. You're very tired, fatigued. But this, once again, can be stress from a variety of different areas. Again, relationships, family, friends, financial, work, and whatever. But when we're exposed to this stress, these hormones are released into our bloodstream, and cortisol being the big one. And it creates all kinds of problems, wreaks all kinds of havoc on our body. But one of the big things it does is it changes our thinking. And it makes us much more susceptible to making these poor decisions. So, this happens, and the key is being aware. Particularly when you're down and out, you are much more vulnerable to making these poor decisions. All right, let's take a look. Big picture, our brain's response to stress. And it starts out in the brain's alarm center. That's our primitive brain, our lizard brain, our survival brain, subconscious, whatever you want to call it. But it takes over. It's very powerful. This part of our brain controls our breathing. It controls our heart rate. It controls our body temperature. And it controls us. But it is all about survival. And it is reactive rather than responsive. And so making decisions under the severe stress and this fight or flight response often leads to poor choices. And as we move down this hierarchy here, if we can weather the storm, the initial storm of this massive stress, and we can get to the point where we use our thinking brain, our prefrontal cortex, it says here the brain CEO, where we can analyze information and decide to design a response rather than react to the stress. You're much more liable to make good decisions, positive decisions with better outcomes. But how do we know? How do we know we're going down this pathway to making poor choices? Well, our brain will tell us. And it communicates with us through emotions and feelings. So we have to pay attention to this, because if you're feeling stressed, if you're angry, if you're frustrated, if you're irritable, you're under the control of the stress hormones, cortisol, under the control of our survival brain, and you're much more apt to make a poor decision. So having this awareness is a critical first step. And so knowing that, and knowing that we're going to have ups and downs in everything we do, and that's just a normal part of your athletic life. It's a normal part of life in general. But if you take those decisions, those poor decisions, and you start stacking them without enough recovery, without enough thought, without enough information, you end up making these terrible mistakes ultimately put you in a hole, which often ends up in injury, burnout, illness, bad season, the end of your career. But if we roll with the tide, so to speak, and we make better decisions, and we know there's going to be ups and downs on the way out, but better decisions, of course, you end up on top when you perform and when you act that way. All right, so let's get into the scientific information that's out there. The hardcore data, this is a major systematic review looking at sports psychology and what are the important factors that play a part in your performance. All right, and let's take a look at the big picture with the world champion standard way. We want to know what really matters. And this is from their article. They're looking at the things that really help. Those are on the top with the bars going to the right, and the things that really hurt on the bottom. And of course, we always want to make things as easy as possible. So let's go where the money is. And look at the top thing. It's off the chart right here. And so immediately we take a look at that, a deep look at that, and look for potential improvements in that area. Okay, so we'll magnify this chart. Once again, this number one thing is off the chart. Very large positive impact. And what is it? Mindfulness. Now, before you turn this off, let's talk about what it is, because I often have athletes, patients, and family who will tell me, I'm just not into that kind of stuff. And I'm like, what? Getting better, improving yourself, digging yourself out of a hole. Don't be that guy or girl, because when you do that, you cut yourself off and you put yourself in a position of severe weakness. Mindfulness is nothing more than sitting down and getting focused on something. And I know there's a million different definitions out there, but it really is that simple. But what we're really talking about is resorting to our critical thinking skills. And they are always there, and you can always access them. The problem is it may be difficult under times of stress, particularly under severe stress. But this generally takes a little more time. It takes some patience, focus, and that's mindfulness. And you got to cut out all the noise first. And you can see some basic critical thinking skills. We talk about reasoning, problem solving, evaluating, decision making, analyzing. This just takes time, quiet thought, and focus on the problems that you're dealing with. And so the bottom line, when we're trying to make good decisions, when we're trying to not make poor decisions, is sit down, write it out, think critically, go through each of these sections, clarify the problem, look at what the question is, identify, the positives and negatives, analyze it, think about it, evaluate it, and then create your response, create your best outcome.